Alrighty guys, welcome to step 3, module 3, foundations. So we're going to be going through form and just a basic outline of a few exercises we really need to master. First thing we're going to start off with is lumbar spine control. So how to control the lower back, obviously the lumbar spine, and this is through pelvic tilts. The first one we got is called an anterior pelvic tilt. That's when we arch through the lower back in that. The second one is a posterior pelvic tilt, and that's when we round through the lower back. We want to know basically how to show a client how to basically understand this and how to move from one to the other. Easiest way to do this is to get them on the floor on all fours, and we can walk them through how to arch their back, how to obviously go into an anterior pelvic tilt, and then how to transition that into a posterior pelvic tilt. And then the midway between the two, the neutral, how to get themselves back to neutral as well. The next one is T-spine control, thoracic spine control. We've got retraction, which is drawing the shoulder blades back, squeezing through the scapula, squeezing through the mid-back. And then we've got protraction, which is separating the shoulder blades and then rounding through the mid-back as well. So straight away, once we've explained this to them, they know how to control their lower back, and then they now know how to control their upper back as well. So their T-spine and their lumbar. Next up is cervical spine control. So we've got elevation and depression. A lot of clients, when they're doing like seated rows, when they're doing certain exercises, even bench press, they're in elevation, which is not going to be very good for their shoulders. So we have to make sure they depress their shoulders down with majority of exercises as well. Next thing, so why is spinal control so important? So here's an image of me basically with protraction and posterior pelvic tilt. If they're in this position here when they're doing deadlifts, when they're doing bent over rows, they're a lot higher risk of injury through their lower back and then through their upper back as well, and their neck and that as well. So if I was to do a deadlift with my back rounded like this, I'm stretching the muscle while loading the muscle as well, which is very dangerous. So we want the clients to come into neutral and understand how to get into neutral, how to make sure their lumbar, thoracic, and their cervical spine is stacked in alignment. Really good, guys. If you guys know the terminology, you know what you're looking for to correct form. First thing we always check with form is where is their spine. Usually if we fix this base here, majority of the problems will go away. The number one highest risk of injury is usually spinal issues. So we want to make sure that this is set up correctly and that we understand lumbar, thoracic, and then cervical spine control as well. Now, once we've explained this to the client and the client seems to understand, we're going to test it. The easiest way to test it is to get someone to plank in that. So going through the form for a plank. Number 1, elbows under the shoulders. Number 2 is post onto the toes, lock the legs out strong. Number 3 is pull the belly button into the back of the spine to brace. Number 4 is eyes to the fingers to keep the neck neutral. Number 5 is pelvis positioned to neutral, so no anterior pelvic tilt or no posterior pelvic tilt. Number 6 is draw the pelvic floor upward to further brace as well. This image here, so straight off the bat here, this is a really good example. So she has her cervical spine basically loaded. Her neck's obviously positioned upward. So if she holds this for a long time, that's going to strain through her neck. And she's slightly tilted at her pelvis as well with an anterior pelvic tilt. So she needs to squeeze her glutes, brace her core more, and then she would get rid of that arch as well. The reason why plank's such a good way to test spinal control is as soon as someone braces up, they're going to have a default. They're going to have their lower back drop into an arch. They're going to have their shoulders round. So we get to really use what they've learned to teach them this as well. So a new client, if they're not very good at this, we want to spend the time with them on the floor, teach them anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt, teach them protraction, retraction, teach them elevation, depression, and then we're able to then coach them way easier with every other exercise as well. Next exercise, guys, is barbell bench press. So these are our cues that we use for barbell bench press. The reason we want to go through the foundations with you guys is we want you to have similar language than the other coaches. If a coach is cueing something completely different, it's going to be very confusing for the client. So we want to make sure we've got a relatively similar dialogue with clients. Barbell bench press, number 1, eyes or chin in line with the bar before we unrack. Number 2 is the feet are planted to the floor, so they're strong from the ground. Number 3 is thumbs lined with the rings, so basically marking symmetry on both sides. Number 4 is neutral wrist, so it's like a punch grip, their knuckles towards the ceiling versus their wrist flexed back, putting load to their wrist. 5 is shoulders need to be retracted, so lats are on, shoulders are pinned back, they're leading through their chest. If their shoulders are in front of their chest, they're going to more so strain their shoulders versus their chest, and they're going to have issues. Number 6, the bar pressing line is center of the chest. Number 7 is elbows are tucked slightly about 45 degrees. So we're not pressing with the elbows up to their ears. Number 8 is slow control on the way down the eccentric. It's controlled. Number 9 is we explode upward on the concentric. So it's more explosive on the hardest part of the rep. Next up, we've got the barbell deadlift. So our starting position, number 1, shins 1 to 2 inches from the bar. Number 2 is hands outside the calves. Number 3 is the T-spine's retracted. Number 4 is we shift the pelvis into neutral, so there's no rounding at the lower back. Number 5, we bend the bar for tight lats. Number 6, we press down into the earth on the rise, so we almost leg press the earth. When the bar gets to the knees, we then thrust the hips and then engage the glutes at the top, which is number 8. Number 9 is we reverse back down, keeping the bar on the skin on the way down. Note for this one as well, guys, this is a hinge pattern, and we start with a rack pull to make it easier. With a broomstick as well, or a very light bar. If someone says they're experienced with deadlifts, we still assume their form is not on point. So we want to start them very light. Once again, the bar, and then if they're looking good, we can start to add the weight on. Next exercise, guys, is the squats. Number 1 is we're going to start with a 14-inch box squat before going to the bar to get full depth before adding the weight. What we'll do is we'll do a 20-kilo goblet squat with a dumbbell or a kettlebell from the 14-inch box. And then when they hit that, they can then move across to the barbell. If we jump into the bar too quickly, too early, they're likely not going to have very good range of motion. They're going to be high risk of injury, and it's not going to look very good. Number 2 is feet shoulder width apart, toes slightly turned out so the knees makes it easier for the knees to open. Number 3, if someone's doing a bodyweight squat, hands are on the shoulders, elbows up to create a tall spine, so straight T-spine. If their arms are just dangling by their side, usually they'll round their shoulders forward, so that's a really quick way to fix that. Number 4 is coming down to take a seat slowly. So they basically come down to a box or a bench to practice actually coming into a seated position. Number 5, the knees open outward and the feet stay planted. So the heels should stay down. If they're really tight through their ankles, you have to really be mindful of pushing them to get their heels down. Number 6, on the rise, we drive through the heels and then the hips as well. And then at the very top, we squeeze the glutes to take pressure off the lower back. Next up, guys, is a seated row. So number 1, neutral grip helps retraction. So a beginner client, we start thumbs up with a neutral grip, like this video here. Number 2 is the knees are slightly bent. This loosens the hamstrings to prevent PPT, posterior pelvic tilt, or rounding at the lower back in that. If they're really tight through their hamstrings, just want to have more knee bend to let more slack to the hammies. Number 3 is the feet are planted. They're sitting strong, they're sitting upright. Number 4 is we row into the rib cage, bringing the thumbs to the lower chest. Number 5 is we retract and squeeze the shoulder blades. Number 6 is elbows stay bent at the bottom of the rep in that, so we're not fully locking out. If a beginner fully locks out, they'll usually lose their retraction and then round as well. Note for this as well, so we use big W's. If the client's really struggling with retraction, we use the exercise called big W's, which your lead mentor will go through with you in person. Next up, guys, is we've got the leg press. So number 1, feet shoulder width and toes slightly turned outward. This is obviously a squat pattern. Number 2, knees track middle of the foot so knees stay open and outward. 3, squatting down, keeping feet planted, so heels down still. Number 4, we drive through the heels to press upward. Number 5, we do not lock the knees at the top in that, so we're keeping tension to the quads by not having a lockout for this exercise, especially if a client has hyperextension through their knees as well. Next up, guys, we've got the lat pull downs. So number 1, we lock legs in place under the pad, slight lean back from the torso, just so you're not going to whack yourself in the nose. Number 2, keeping the shoulders retracted. Number 3, we're going to bring the bar to the top of the sternum. Number 4 is we're going to keep forearms upright as we're pulling down. So if the forearms shift forward, they're going to be feeling it more in their shoulders. So you want to have the forearms upright as the bar travels down. Number 5, on the rise, we're going to keep our elbows in line with the eyes to prevent elevation for beginners. So we don't want them to have their shoulders shrug up to their ears, especially if they're a beginner as well. It's going to be a bit too much stretch for their lats and pressure on their shoulder. Next up, dumbbell bench press. Number 1, feet planted to the floor. Number 2, rolling the scapula back, so getting retraction to make sure the chest is leading in front of the shoulders. Number 3, keeping the dumbbells in line with the anterior delts. So when we're coaching a beginner, we want to keep them wide as they're pressing. If they press the dumbbells together, they'll likely roll their shoulders forward and lose their retraction. Number 4 is we slowly lower the weight down in about 3 seconds so it's controlled. Number 5 is we're explosive on the press without locking the elbows at the top. Note how to come down. We always want to tell a client how to come out of the exercise so they don't damage their shoulders. We bring the dumbbells towards the chest and then down to your lap, and then we stand up from there. Next one, guys, is leg lifts. So number 1 is we force the posterior pelvic tilt. We're actually pushing more of a pelvic tilt here to engage through the lower abdominals. So we want them to have a flat back to the floor If they're arching, they're just going to use more of their lower back and their hip flexors versus their lower abdominals. Number 2, core is tight, belly button's pulled inward as they're holding. Number 3 is we extend single legs down to the floor first, while keeping obviously the first 2 steps in place. We don't want to do double legs for a beginner because they'll just start arching their back. And we can do bent knees versus straight legs to make it easier for someone as well. Number 4 is they can put their hands under their glutes if they need assistance keeping their back down. It does make the exercise a lot easier by helping that posterior tilt. Note as well, this exercise strengthens the lower abdominals, which is going to help reducing APT, anterior pelvic tilt, or that arch at their lower back. If a client's having a lot of lower back pain because they have a high lumbar arch, they might be like desk bound at work, or they might have just gone through a pregnancy. So they're going to have a high anterior pelvic tilt. So this is a great exercise to be able to shift their pelvis back into position and relieve a lot of back pain as well. Last exercise today, guys, is lunges. So number 1, feet shoulder width apart when we start. We don't want to start on a tightrope. We want to start with a decent width. Number 2 is stepping backwards for a beginner. So obviously traveling lunges and forward lunges for someone that's advanced. Beginner, it's easier to step backwards because we set up the front leg first. So they're not going to have as much movement in their knee, which will be safer. Number 3 is keeping the heel at the front planted and staying high on the back toes. Number 4 is dropping down with control, so they're not just falling, they're controlling themselves down. Number 5 is on the bottom position. We want to see a 90-degree angle with the front knee and the back knee. So we have that front shin especially vertical, so we're not putting too much pressure to the knee. Number 6 is we press hard from the front heel to launch upward. Note as well, so with this exercise here, this is a high risk of knee pain for beginners, so be ready to regress. So this is our foundations, guys. So what we have now is you'll have a quiz. You'll go through a walkthrough with the manager in person to tick off these exercises as well together. And then you'll go through and bring a friend or a family member into the gym as well, and we'll go through foundations with them in person as well, just to learn the process further and a bit more practice and to test how well we know the exercises as well. Looking forward to seeing you guys soon in the gym.